So we're going to take questions now for the two speakers who've spoken already, and then after that, myself and Rachel Ash will tell you something about the 2018 conference. So the roving microphones are ready. We've had two really interesting talks that begin to kind of look forward, some encouraging signs of partnership in your talk with the initiatives with the herbal teas and various other companies, making sure that wild plants are taken sustainably and used sustainably, and then some calls for action from your talk. So can I open the floor to questions?
So this is a question about which ties both into the plants. There's obviously a school of thinking in traditional Chinese medicine that comes from southern China, which is actually focused purely on the use of medicinal plants rather than using animal-based products. So I'm just interested to see whether or not you guys have actually spoken about that at all, and what the support is, or if there is a division within the wider TCM group of promoting the use of medicinal plants rather than the inclusion of animal parts in medicinal products.
Your question is about whether there's a division between regions, southern part of China or northern part of China. Before 1950s, China did not have medical education or universities. And from 1950s, they established medical universities in China for traditional Chinese medicine. Therefore, all the textbooks, curriculum, requirements for medical training would be the same. China emphasizes localized Chinese herbs grow in certain area with its water, climate, mountain, and temperature. So localized herbs would have specific medicinal functions. That has been emphasized. But if you talk about the divisions, I would say medical training would be the same, and the curriculum would be the same. Herbal medicine training would be the same, except different regions would probably use more localized material, medical, in treating diseases.
My quick comment is we've been, as a lot of other organizations, involved in some projects looking at how the use of endangered animal parts can be replaced with medicinal plants. And I think there are some successes. I think something that I've been observing is an issue of demand and who's actually using those products, and whether the demand for those replacement substitute products would be the same, because they may sound good and they could actually be substantiated, as you say, by the medical tradition, but then it really depends on the consumer. So I wouldn't be able to answer your question. I don't know if anybody in the room would be able to enlighten us about some of that work. But I think, just in general on traditional Chinese medicine, and so much more about this, of course, but I've been always working with traditional Chinese medicine companies. I've been fascinated by the philosophy of it. And if you look in the depths of Dao-Di, for example, so if you think a geo-authentication of species origin, traditional Chinese medicine is sustainable by its definition. It says that the species can only come from particular places, which by definition means there is a certain amount of them out there. But then, of course, TCM is facing massive issue of globalization and really growing demand by industry, which takes it away from the practitioners and really the use for smart treatment into the globalized world where we're speaking about the millions tons of ingredients traded. So it's an interesting question.
The lady there, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, I work with the Alliance of Religions and Conservation. We work with religious groups on conservation issues, and we've been working with the Taoist Association in China for many years. And Taoism is the spiritual and philosophical basis of TCM, and we've been working with Taoist masters and temples to help raise awareness about not using animal parts and products in TCM, and they've been really strong advocates of using sustainable plants instead. And they also seem to increasingly be treating rural populations with locally with sustainable remedies that they're now starting to grow around their temples. So I think there is increasingly this movement among the Taoists, which of course have temples all across China, and they're very influential in TCM and also in people's choices about use of threatened species, not only in medicines, but in luxury goods and food. We're working with Taoist masters who are consulted by the elite in China on well-being. They go seek out these Taoist masters for the secrets of wellness and well-being, and they've been increasingly communicating these messages to them about not using ivory and threatened species in traditional medicines. So I just thought I'd mention that. Thanks.
Gentleman in the... Did you have a question for the speakers?
A question for Lixin. You mentioned a lot of countries adopting traditional Chinese medicine. You didn't mention the United Kingdom. Do you think that's because we have a national health system and are very conservative?
That's a question you should answer, not me. As far as I know, that traditional Chinese medicine was introduced and then practiced in United Kingdom, and United Kingdom was one of the earliest countries that accept and welcomed traditional Chinese medicine. But a few years ago, there was a slash taken by the United Kingdom, and therefore, as far as I know, herbal medicine is no longer being legal, recognized here. In US, it's recognized as food supplement. We don't call Chinese herbal medicine as medicine, we call that as food. It's the same thing as you can buy, except when the herbs are prescribed by practitioners, then they become medicinal functioning food. In UK, that is not allowed. So that's what I know. Acupuncture, I think, is still practiced here, but not Chinese herbal medicine anymore.
And to add to that, do you think the addition of TCM in the World Health Organization's list might change that?
That's going to be interesting because the medical codes right now, the international medical community use ICD-10 and ICD-11, I think in probably about 2-3 years will be available. This is first time that traditional medicine is included in the medical codes. That means when you have codes for Western medicine, then traditional medicine is together in that codes. How would that change the medical practice by integrating them would be a really interesting exploration.
Any more questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Thank you. It was actually about the Fair Wild standard. I suppose it's fantastic that we have this now. It's the first time I've heard of it. I suppose I just wanted to know a bit about the challenges, because I imagine the amount, for businesses to want to do it, consumers almost need to be putting the pressure on them. But do consumers even know much about this? There's so many competing standards now. How, what are your plans for the future to make this more, make the general public more aware of it?
I think with the Fair Wild standard work in the past, say 5 years, and Fair Wild standard is owned legally by a different organization, not Traffic, called Fair Wild Foundation. most of the work that was spent is on developing the actual tool. So making sure we have a credible standard at hand, because it's a complicated business in itself to be running a standard that requires full traceability of production, but also is fair trade and is managed in a good way. Now, in terms of the uptake by the industry, it's really been driven by industry so far, which explains in part which species are covered by the Fair Wild certification scheme, because they're rather lower risk, less threatened species. Because in terms of piloting a new approach in corporate social responsibility, I don't know of any company that would start from, CITES listed endangered species to pilot a good practices. So in terms of future, I think one of the development is to work further with the companies already engaged for them to extend the use of Fair Wild for the whole range of their products. We've been also contemplating quite a bit about, well, what do we do about wider market transformation and the partnerships needed for that? Because, of course, we're working with a huge number of species. You could start anywhere. Something we've been talking a bit about is whether we could, motivate with others sort of a flagship approach, plantship approach, where we could focus on a smaller number of plants that are recognizable by consumers, but also that have issues around conservation, be it a selection of CITES listed species, Appendix 2, which could be traded sustainably, but in practice, there is maybe little demonstration of this, and drive sort of consumer demand and interest on the back of it as well, because as you say, one thing we realized that it's not just consumers don't know much about wild plant sourcing, they don't know that a product X does contain wild plant in it, because if you look at the ingredients list, you might read a botanical name, but whether it's wild or not. So something I was talking about is this Fair Wild Week, which sort of started very gently just by talking to people about the beauty of plants and wild ingredients, because the consumer issue is a bit difficult. I think with the consumption of particular illegally traded animal parts, for example, we often speak about a very particular set of population. With trade in wild plants, we speak about everyone. So it's sort of trying to influence everyone sitting here, everyone elsewhere. So for me, part of the aim is educate everyone here about Fair Wild, Fair Wild label. But I think it's sort of a big road ahead on how to sort of wrap up the uptake. And just in terms of the challenge, I think something we've been seeing a lot in the past few years was the sort of running Fair Wild is very expensive. So I think the sustainability of initiative and how it's been taken up, it is very difficult to get a donor who would actually underwrite some of the basic costs of it, not the implementation projects. And that's something that I'm sure everybody can relate with as well. Thank you.
One last question from the audience.
I want to be cheeky and ask two questions, but one of them is really quick and a follow-on from that question, really. So you said about the plants, it's been largely industry-driven. And I'm kind of interested as to why that is. And is there any evidence that companies are going to make more profits as a result of this, or do you think it's mainly legality and reputation-based? And then my other question is about the traditional Chinese medicine. It kind of strikes me that TCM is kind of like a philosophy, right? And it's a very holistic way of looking at health. And it's kind of intuitive. It makes a lot of sense. It's about healthy eating and healthy lifestyle, and not just specifically about medicine. And also, I think, to do with the way that patients are treated, in that there's kind of a consultation process, and people are kind of well looked after, and it's very personalised. And is there any way, or anybody looking into kind of teasing apart, what are the physiological aspects of traditional Chinese medicine, and what are these more holistic aspects in terms of what are the real benefits of TCM? Is it because it's this holistic approach and because patients are being counselled and looked after better? And what are the physiological bits? Or is it just all too messy and complicated?
Want to take first?
Okay. So thanks a lot for the question. I think in terms of the companies that have been taking up Fair Wild certification so far, if you imagine the innovation uptake graph, we are on the level of early adopters taking up the Feyerwild still. So they're companies mostly driven by their wanting to do the best. So very ethically driven companies. I invited to the business engagement session tomorrow. We'll have two companies who are working with Feyerwild who could share their experiences and explain why they're actually doing it. But I think because we're at this very early adopter stage, we need more early adopters. But then the big question is, well, how do we get from companies that are already committed to doing good in the world as well as doing business to companies that are primarily doing business and are probably dealing with 1,000 other issues that that they're being sort of asked about.
As a medical education, we truly train students physiologically to understand the body, and then how to really do diagnosis from understanding of the body. Students are required to also study Western medicine, anatomy, physiology, chemistry, biology, internal medicine, pharmacopoeia, and etc., clinical research. So these are all included in the curriculum. And in the TCM part, they also study tremendously about how the body is looked by traditional Chinese medical system, which is not the same as Western medicine purely look at only lab. They look at the person, we all live in a very fast-paced world. We as individuals could experience from being very healthy to being very sick. There's quite a process. Your body will give you the message in different phases of that process. Do you respond to it? And Chinese medicine will teach how you look at the human being in this from very healthy to very sick stage. But the training is truly physiological, and from diagnosis to a variety of treatments. For American students to spend 4 to 5 academic years to study this medical system, this is not only about philosophy. Philosophy is only a small portion of it in fundamental theory of traditional Chinese medicine that include Taoism, that include the Buddhism, and how ancient healers look at the body. But that's not the focus. The whole focus is physiological and disease and then treatment prevention.
Thank you very much, both of you, for really interesting talks and for your questions. I'm sure the conversation will continue in the coffee break afterwards. Can we thank our speakers again? So we've got about 15 minutes now. And what we'd like to do is start a bit of a conversation with you. So when Joss was speaking this morning and saying he's a real newcomer to the subject of illegal wildlife trade, I can really identify with that, having been in my current role for 9 months and Rachel a little bit less. And we have the responsibility of organising a conference in 2018. So we wanted to tell you a little bit about where our thinking is at the moment, and ask for your comments and suggestions and insights from your years and years of experience in this field. So to introduce myself again, I'm Debbie Hembury. I'm head of the Illegal Wildlife Trade team at DEFRA in the International Division, which means that I'm responsible for... So I'm head of the Illegal Wildlife Trade team at DEFRA, which means I'm responsible for DEFRA's illegal wildlife trade policy, working closely with the CITES team and with other teams, including CBD, Nagoya Protocol, and also responsible for some of our program spend. So I'm the policy advisor for the Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund, which some of you will be familiar with and has been mentioned a few times today, and also responsible for delivering the commitments the UK made at the Hanoi conference.
And we're going to do quite a lot of this, backwards and forwards, interchanging. My name's Rachel Ash. I am head of the Illegal Wildlife Trade team in the Foreign Commonwealth Office. We are involved really looking at this from a foreign policy, international perspective in terms of the UK's interest. And part of the logic for this is recognising the impacts of the illegal wildlife trade being much broader than the sort of immediate environmental conservation impacts, and really understanding how it relates to our wider interests in terms of international development, security, economic growth, these sorts of things. And also a recognition that in many countries, not all, environment ministries are often a little way down the pecking order in terms of budget and power, in terms of decisions, and seeing how we can use our network of diplomats and over 200 missions around the world to really help with those conversations about why we need to put enough political will to take action on the wildlife trade.
And then, as well as Foreign Office and DEFRA, of course, another key department in Whitehall on the issue of illegal wildlife trade is DFID. They will be an equal partner, so the three departments will be organising the conference and also having the policy discussions around what direction we're heading in and what we're trying to achieve through the conference in 2018. And DFID are really key, I think, in tackling some of those systemic development challenges that arise when you're trying to tackle illegal wildlife trade and provide sustainable alternatives in some of the source countries and demand countries as well.
So 3 departments working together to organise the conference, but it's also worth just briefly mentioning the cross-cutting nature of this issue and quite a lot of other bits of government involved with us. The Home Office in particular, from the law enforcement perspective, both in the UK and internationally. The Treasury, looking at financial crime and corruption in that regard, and a number of others. I won't go into too much detail there. So we've just got 2 slides, so I won't keep you too long. This is our first slide. A little bit of history, the background. We first held an international conference at sort of heads of state and foreign minister level in the UK in 2014. 46 countries came together in 11 international organisations and adopted a declaration called the London Declaration. The reason for having this conference was a recognition that there's an awful lot of good work going on tackling the illegal wildlife trade around the world, between governments, between NGOs, academia, international organisations, but there wasn't really one place that was bringing it together at that high political level and trying to get that strategic overview and get that political will and engagement from leaders. So that was the idea of bringing it together in 2014. And that London Declaration was where we sort of pulled together the various commitments governments were making in one place, and it still really sets the framework for what we're trying to achieve. There have been 2 subsequent conferences, 2015 in Kasane in Botswana, where they had a further statement which brought on some more political commitments to what we're trying to do and also moved more into the implementation phase. And then Vietnam hosted the most recent conference in Hanoi, where the focus was again moving more towards how do we implement these high-level commitments that we've made internationally.
And then Rachel's mentioned the London Declaration, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 4 pillars that the London Declaration set out, the strategic approach to tackling IWT, but I think it kind of bears reminding ourselves that they were eradicating the market for illegal wildlife products, ensuring effective legal frameworks and deterrence, strengthening law enforcement, and of course, supporting sustainable livelihoods and economic development. And those 4 pillars remain relevant today. Much has been done, but there's still lots to do and lots of questions to answer, as we've heard through some of the presentations today. So we're intending to use those 4 pillars to kind of inform and frame the conference in 2018. So moving on to the conference, it's worth saying that we're in the early stages of planning. So we've still got lots of kind of consultation to do and discussions to have, and we're seeing this as really part of that. So we're really keen to hear what you have to contribute. And there's lots of excellent work that's gone on around the world. We've heard some of it today as well on sustainable trade, on understanding cultural differences and drivers for the trade, in influencing to change behaviour, and in sustainable management. We want to really make sure that we make the most of the opportunity that this conference is offering us, and do the things that will be the most useful and act in the places where only governments can act to intervene. We have 2 secretaries of state really engaged, proactively engaged on this issue. The Secretary of State for DEFRA has visited Heathrow today to have a look at the border force operation there, how they police the borders, the Animal Reception Centre, how they enforce the CITES rules. And as Rachel's previously said, the Foreign Secretary is extremely personally engaged with this issue. And the junior ministers at both departments as well, with responsibilities for IWT, are really keen to be involved in the planning for the conference and to make a success of it. And they'll be announcing the dates and the high-level themes very soon. But we thought we'd just talk through with you where our thinking is with respect to the shape of the conference.
Yeah, so we've sort of set out 5 sort of principal sort of questions here, which is how we're sort of framing what we want to narrow down into some more specifics about exactly what our objectives are going to be for the conference. For starters, making it clear that we recognise we're convening a global coalition here of quite a lot of countries playing different roles and bringing different things to the table and doing an awful lot of work. I'm sure you will hear our politicians at some point talking about UK leadership on this area, because that's my job as the Foreign Office, to talk about that kind of thing. But really recognising that we want to put that platform together and allow a range of different countries to talk about what's working for them and what they're achieving, so we can learn from each other. Again, trying to get commitment at the very highest political levels was the sort of objective of this conference, a series of conferences. And as I mentioned earlier, focusing on implementation of the high-level political commitments we've got. And I think that's resonated from me, particularly from some of the talks we heard this morning, sort of how do you make sure the sort of very high-level governments commit to this and that, and the sort of practical on the ground, what works, what's the gap in between that we need to be addressing, how do we make that join up, and where do governments, in terms of international cooperation, need to do that join up.
And then as well, adding to that theme of providing a platform, we want to celebrate successes. So there has been lots of progress since the 2014 London conference. A couple that spring to mind are the work of the Transport Task Force to bring businesses in, and various, there are a number of successful Challenge Fund projects, including some excellent work in Malawi to strengthen the law enforcement cooperation there that led to some successful arrests of people trafficking wildlife goods. But there's no doubt lots more, and there's no doubt lots more that we in the UK don't know about. So we want to provide that platform, recognising that one approach doesn't always work in every place, providing a platform for countries to come and explain what approaches have taken that have worked for them, so that we can learn from each other and make sure that we're involving all of those other key countries in the discussion at the conference.
We've already talked about our third bullet point about making sure we're focusing on where governments and intergovernmental cooperation can make the biggest difference. One example of this, I think, is probably going to be law enforcement, and that feels like it resonates from what we've been talking about again this morning. The role that governments need to play in doing that collaboration between different ends of the trade when it's happening cross borders. And also, I think hopefully more than previous conferences, looking at systemic issues related to illegal wildlife trade. So I was having some interesting conversations with people over lunch about corruption, which is another sort of area where the UK government has tried to be proactive internationally in building collaboration. And where is the IWT facilitating corruption, but also how corruption is contributing to IWT being a problem, as one example.
And then last but not least, engaging all of the sectors, some of which you represent here today. So the private sector, businesses, financial institutions, academia, including the Oxford Martin programme, of course, and civil society as well. So we want, I think, to do even more of this than we've done with previous conferences. In the UK, we've got an incredibly proactive and strong scientific basis, a huge number of NGOs doing some great work. So we want to bring all of those organisations in to help us make a success of the conference and really move the conversation forward. And just to say, we included these pictures because we wanted to find some not so charismatic megafauna to include. So the electric rock gecko, and I have to confess, I'm not 100% sure that this parakeet or parrot is an endangered species. So I'm sure somebody will correct me if he isn't. But just to say that it's, you know, it's a strategic approach that we want to take rather than being species focused. I don't know if we have any minutes for any questions or comments now. I'll look to... Yeah, just a few comments, questions, and then we'll hand over to you to tell us about what's happening in the break. Stay here.
There's one halfway up the back there.
Thank you very much. Back at the last occasion when the UK hosted the conference in 2014, the UK government published its commitment to action on illegal wildlife trade from the UK's perspective, and I think we had an update in 2015 on what had happened since. Can we expect a similar update or recommitment to action from the UK government in particular at next year's conference?
I don't know if we'll be doing it in the same way we've done in previous years, but yeah, it would be pretty silly to have an international conference and not talk about what the UK is going to contribute to that. So we will do that in some form or another. Down here.
Just a little bit of feedback on a couple of things you mentioned. Personally, I think the anti-corruption thing is huge. Having worked for a couple of NGOs in a couple of developing countries, corruption is one of the biggest issues with illegal wildlife trade, but as an NGO, you're there at the invitation of the government often, and wildlife NGOs in developing countries work completely differently to the way NGOs work in the UK, for example. People are kind of criticising and lobbying the government in England, but when you're at the invitation of the government, you're there to support the government and to try and celebrate their successes. And so, as like a small wildlife NGO, corruption isn't really something that you can touch. But from my experience, it's one of the biggest issues for all illegal wildlife trade. And so I think that's somewhere where governments can potentially have a massive impact, because reducing corruption would have huge, wide-reaching impacts, I think, on wildlife trade all over the world. I also think maybe with illegal wildlife trade, especially with the sharks thing, it's kind of the responsibility of developed countries to set an example to developing countries to commit to traceability measures, for example. So in my talk, I went on about how difficult it is for Indonesia to implement species-specific trade controls. And so I think it's the responsibility of richer countries with better systems and capacity to start developing systems and measures for these species-specific controls, and to then put pressure on the big companies who are exporting these products to say, we are now controlling this, and you guys are not going to be allowed to import, because often in the shark trade it's also linked to tuna and that kind of thing, to be able to then put pressure back on the big companies to say, right, you can't import tuna into England until you prove that none of your shark exports are CITES-listed species, for example. Because I think at the moment there's probably quite a high risk that CITES-listed sharks are making it into potentially UK markets, American markets, I don't know. And so maybe it's up to developed countries to set an example for that and put pressure on industry.
We're probably out of time.
We will be around in the coffee breaks and this evening's poster session, etc., to carry on the conversation. We're really keen to hear from all of you, so please do come and find us. And then maybe one last question from Rosaline.
Yeah, it'll be very quick. It's a comment. I would encourage you to find ways of bringing in a different range of voices as you develop the conference, because there's a danger that a lot of us know each other, a lot of us think the same way, and actually getting different kinds of perspectives might give you a kind of fresher or more innovative approach at the end.
Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Jenny to tell us what we should all be doing with our cups of coffee in hand.